where he held executive roles at companies like Lightro, RockQ, StumbleUpon, and Yahoo. And he made a debut in the Indian startup ecosystem with Myntra, where he delivered a technology-led transformation into this business, and all of us know Myntra as one of the benchmarks of user experience. So we are super glad to have Shamik. Welcome, Shamik.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here.
Great. To the audience, I want to just make an announcement that this is an interactive session. Uh, on your right hand menu, if people from the desktop can only interact in person, people who are accessing from mobile can actually use the chat feature to post questions. But people who are accessing from the desktop can actually raise a hand, and we can get them on the stage here, and they can ask a question. So just to demo, can I ask Manoj Singh, co-founder Airme, to raise his hand? Okay, Ravi Bhushan has raised his hand. Hey.
Hi.
So, hey Ravi.
Hey, hi. Just trying to explore.
Hey, so Ravi.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, Ravi. Nice to meet you too.
So Ravi was the CTO of Prop Tiger.
Great.
Cool. Okay, cool. So Ravi, I'm returning your mic. Great. So I'll start my questions, Shamik.
Sure.
So you are a Silicon Valley veteran, Shamik, and you've seen startups from the inside in the Valley and now in Bangalore also. So what is the internal difference that you have observed between startups in the Valley and startups in Bangalore?
Good question. I think it's mostly to do with the maturity of the ecosystem. I don't think it's actually a cultural thing, because I think the world is getting globalized, and the differences between the people, I think, is getting more and more reduced. So I won't focus on that. I think it's more about the ecosystem and people's awareness of what a startup entails. I actually came to India in 2005 for the first time, and I was trying to do a startup there and in Hyderabad, and the world was very different. There were no there's no VCs, there were no entrepreneurs wanting to do startups, employees didn't want to join. And if you look at the time period in 2005 to 2012, when I came back to India to join Myntra, the world had actually changed quite a lot. And between 2009 and 2019, obviously, it's changed 20 now. It's changed quite a lot more. But still, it's only about a 10-year period that India actually has had startups. And whereas the Valley is probably since about 1975, 78, when Apple and Intel and so on started coming out in the Valley. So it's a huge difference of almost 3x in terms of time period. But it's actually much more, because it's a generational gap. It's enough for one generation to have made money and then passed it on to their children and kids, and the media and awareness is all very, very different. So what that actually relates to, as you are executive in any startup or a founder, is that you take a lot of things for granted in the West. If you have a good idea, you will be able to raise money. It's not a big deal. You will not be running out of money just because there's a slight downturn or a slight period. Employees are not too scared about doing a startup, because most people have family savings and so on. And most people that are doing startups there are also usually not freshers or very young people. They're actually people who have worked for 4 or 5 years and have some savings. So their anxiety and pressures of, what will happen is not so different. It's not so high. The salary, most people take a big pay cut in order to do a startup, because they want to take ESOPs and stock. In India, most people don't even believe in stock, because they haven't seen people make wealth. Yeah. So a lot of these dynamics are different, and that relates to what you actually see in the environment. How to hire? You actually have to pay more in India to actually get people to join a startup. So there's many risks that are risk reward ratios are very different in people's minds, and that relates to how they work, what they do, and so on. But I think it is changing. So in the last 2-3 years, I think it's very different than in 2012-13, when Myntra was still a small company. People have seen people, other friends, and so on, making wealth through exits and so on. So the dynamics are changing, but I think still there's a big difference.
Sure. Great. So in your career, we have led transformations at various points. So at RockQ, at StumbleUpon, and in the Indian startup ecosystem in Myntra. So could you tell us a bit about the challenge that you had at Myntra when you landed there, and how technology played a major role in the Breakout success?
Yeah. So before, people might think, oh, Myntra is very successful, so you must have done something right, and so on. First, I'll say that startups are very risky. You're always making decisions every week, every month. There are pretty big, dramatic decisions, and many of them don't go right. And some of them might be catastrophic also, right? And you just take the whole company down with you. And what I say with the reason I say that is that because Myntra was almost my sixth or seventh startup, and while some things might have worked right at Myntra, equally the decisions could have gone wrong. And in the past, for example, RockQ, a company that was valued over $700 million and finally got at some point valued of only about $10-20 million. So there's been collapses as well in my career, right? And many companies that raised a lot of money and then became worth nothing. Lightro is a good example. Again, raised over $120 million and got sold to Google for about 20, right? So there are. I don't want to project myself as having. I know what the decisions were that led to success. You try to make the best decision you can given the information you have. The more experiences you have in what works, what doesn't work, you'll make slightly better decisions. But of course, timing is different, context is different, and so on. So a lot of these things are hard to say, what was the right decision, what is the wrong decision. At the time I joined Myntra, there were about 10, 15 companies in fashion e-commerce. If people remember, there was Yepi, Yepme, Fashionara, Fashion and You, Jabong, Myntra, and several others as well, Cooves, etc. And it wasn't clear what the right strategy is. And, Myntra, for those who have the history, was started out as a customizing of t-shirts and mugs and so on. And when I was joining, they were just in the midst of a pivot to becoming a pure fashion e-commerce company. And it wasn't clear whether that would work, especially because there are so many other players already, and some of them are a little bit ahead of Myntra. So, the key thing that I think we focused on, number one, was fashion. So you can't just say, I want to do some certain technology in the vacuum of knowledge of what the market is. So if you're doing fashion, what is fashion about? It's about price, of course, but it is also a little bit about brand, and it's a lot about impulse, liking the product, right? So hence, we felt like projecting the product very well, the brand and the quality of the product, which meant then that it had to become a very, very beautiful site, right? Because you're kind of selling beauty, right? And hence, that meant that, if you had to differentiate yourself from Amazon and, Flipkart and Jabong and all the other players at the time, we said, okay, the pivot that we need to focus on is to make the experience, and I mean by that the shopping experience, beautiful, right? This is the difference between a big bazaar and a shopper stop. People are familiar with that concept in India. And if you ask people what's the difference between big bazaar and shopper stop, they will say ambiance, right? It's just the whole, brands and the feel and so on. So we had said, okay, that's simple. So let's just kind of replicate that online. And that led to the fact that, okay, Myntra will be a very front-end focused company. It doesn't have to worry as much about scale as Flipkart and Amazon and so on. So most of the engineering, most of the tech, most of the product, UX, all of that focused on making a beautiful shopping experience. And of course, there are certain back-end supply chain things like returns and so on, which are very important in fashion. We focused on those aspects of it.
Great. So, any questions around about the Myntra experience from the audience? Okay, cool. I'll move on to the next question. So in India, especially, there are many startups where the internal conversation is dominated by business mindset and business things, right? So as CTOs, it's many times it's very difficult to put forward a strategic let's say program which is technology centric, right? This could be related to a platform upgrade or adding a new dimension to the product, for example in AI, right? So what advice would you give to CTOs if they have something which is technology centric but is very strategic to propose to the business stakeholders?
Yeah, good question. Before I give the answer, let me just give some context. Like, I'm also an investor. I'm actually an investor in Airmeet as well. But I've invested in many companies, like about 10, 15 now. And besides that, I'm also a part-time venture capitalist at Pi Ventures. So I see a lot of other companies as well. And one of the things I actually find is that India is kind of polarized. People are very function dependent. So, for example, the business guy and some operations folks, they think I know business and I know operations, and I have to ask for technology and so on from the CTO or the CPO or someone. And similarly, and you think that's wrong, but I think equally wrong is that the technologists think of themselves as, okay, I'm going to handle technology, I'm going to handle product, and I'm going to wait for the request to come in, and then I'm going to push back, and I'm going to say, okay, no, tech debt has to be done, and so on, right? So these are two very siloed point of views of saying, okay, I only own technology, and I'm going to protect my turf and make sure that the technical things are done and the hard technical scale problems are solved and so on. And the business guys typically and the operations guys are thinking about, okay, how do I solve these operational problems and how do I make sure that tech kind of supports me, right? This is kind of the polarized view that exists in most companies in India, which is very unfortunate. And this, I think, has come a lot because, we are still very early in the product ecosystem. And secondly, we have come from a history of large service-oriented companies where that was the relationship between the client and the technology provider. And we've kind of taken that same thing saying that, okay, this is the client, the business side, and this is the technology provider, which is the tech side. It's a very service mindset. So I think that has to break, right? So first of all, I think, CTOs, while they should be pushing for the tech debt and so on, if that's all you're pushing for, you will very soon lose trust in the organization. You have to be able to you have to understand the entire product, entire business, understand what the entire requirements of the company are, and then be able to very rationally prioritize that and say, okay, this time this operational problem is very important. This other time this tech debt problem is very important. This other time the scale problem is dependent. This time none of these things, but some new initiative like mobile, which nobody is asking for, not even the customers, that is going to be the most important because this is what is happening in the world and this will change, right? So being able to make this entire sets of decisions in a very rational, unemotional, unbiased way kind of builds trust in the organization. And that is when, when you do make a case for a very strong tech debt effort, then you're able to make that case, right? What I find is that because you're always kind of being the guy who argues for tech debt or scale or, I need to buy more systems or we need to invest in this thing, everybody kind of tunes out, okay, this is the person that's crying wolf, right? And then all your other arguments and everything else kind of falls by the wayside. So the first thing to do is to not think of yourself as the CTO, but as a CXO, right? And to say, okay, I am equally responsible, just like everybody else on that management table, to think about the benefit of the company and to see what is right. And I can make those trade-offs just like everyone else there.
Interesting. I think very, very valuable input there. And my other question is, that these days we have started to see a new role emerging, which is the chief product officer.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not really sure how at certain stage of a company where is the boundary, right? Is the CPO supposed to think about the strategy of user experience and technology, or is the CTO supposed to think about it? So can you share with your experience, what is the principal level demarcation between the territory?
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to this question, right? And I think it's actually people ask me a lot, right? Because mostly I've done a joint role in most companies I've been in. And sometimes I've switched between roles. So I was, for example, the chief architect in the company I own. I founded a company in the Valley, which I was the chief architect of, which is a very technical role. But there was no product officer, so I was also doing the CPO role. And after that, I became a director of products in a startup. And then I switched to a VP of engineering role at both Yahoo and StumbleUpon. And then at RockU, I was the CPO equivalent and then eventually the CEO. And then I moved into a CTO, CPO role here as well. So it's been a very big, very mixed thing. I can't tell myself, what I am really. And I think if you ask people at Myntra, most of the technologists would think that, oh, he's acting like a CPO, and most of the product buyers, oh, he's too much of a CTO, right? And I think that's fair because there needs to be a natural tension between product managers and engineers, and that. The tension is that the technologists have to figure out how to build stuff, when to build it, and how much what technology, how, basically what tech stacks and how much scale and all of those things, right? So these are longer term items. They usually don't get solved in a quarter. They get solved in 6 months, 9 months. So there's a longer cycle towards the problems you can think of and the problems you can solve. Product people are much more external focused. They're focused on how we should build things, what customers are wanting, what the product features should be, and they tend to be very short cycle focused, like typically a quarter or maybe 2 quarters, right? And they should be, because they are looking at what we can quickly make an impact on what customer problems are there. That tension, it's very hard to find in one person, right? It's very hard to say, okay, you should be a little bit more strategic, long-term, perfection oriented, which is what a CTO should be, and the CPO should be much more customer focused, external focused, and so on, right? So I think the problem is there's a big advantage of having it together and a big disadvantage. The big advantage is that you can take the external thing and you can figure out how to make it, and you can make quick trade-offs. You don't have to go and talk to this person and figure out, okay, should I make this or not, because it'll take 2 years. Oh, if it's 2 years, then no, then I don't want this product, right? Those kinds of discussions have to happen before you can make a decision. Whereas if you know both sides, you can quickly make those calls. The disadvantage is that, of course, you're getting biased internally in your head, right? You're making, sometimes you're trading off of technology that you shouldn't have. You should have built the thing very long term and architecturally perfect, and you didn't do that because you had some product pressures on you. And on the other hand, the reverse also happens, right? You're in the midst of building some beautiful architectural system, and then the market changes and the customers want something else, but you're already wedded to this thing that you're building, and hence you want to stick to it, right? So these kinds of reasons are why most companies in the long term go into two separate roles. In the early stages of a company, however, I think the advantages of having a CPO and a CTO kind of together is very important, is very good, because the product market fit is not yet there, and you might need to pivot and change things quite a lot, right? So I feel that in the early times, it's better to have somebody who can do both. Of course, that depends on whether you can find such a person, right, who has both hats and can think both. If not, get two people, right? But if you can find somebody, which is a very big if, then having that together in the initial stages is good.
I think very, very good, response to that. You articulated it right, that the tension in one's mind is very important, because I rarely find people who are passionate about long term and the short term. So there is a question from Shrikant Balakrishnan, who is the CTO of Enchanting Travels.
Hey, hi, Shamik. Great to hear your journey so far. Just had a quick question while you talk about CTO and CPO. How was your typical day look like in a Myntra, like a good day?
The good days are few and far between. But no, I think, it's, I wouldn't say it was a day. I would say I would break it up into quarters. Mm-hmm. And there would be quarters when I was acting almost 80-90% as a CTO, and then there were quarters or even years when I would be operating almost 80-90% as a CPO. So mm-hmm. I would be switching roles, and the way I usually would do it is that, for example, I'll come back to another topic, which is, I believe that there are certain step functions that people have to go through, and you kind of mm-hmm. almost have to force-fit changes into the organization. So, mm-hmm. for example, at Myntra, we would think of, a year's boundary as, a step function. And we would say, okay, this year, we have to do something dramatically different, right? And what mm-hmm. are those things? And if mm-hmm. in the next year, I felt like the next big things were in the product side, mm-hmm. then I would take on the product role and I would delegate most of the engineering roles to somebody else.
Got it.
And for the rest of the year, I would act almost, fully like a CPO, whereas there would be years when I was mostly like a CTO. For example, sure. In 2013, we decided that we need to rewrite the stack from PHP to Java and microservices and so on. Mm-hmm. And that whole year, I think I would have acted almost 80-90% as a CPO. And in 2014, when the whole mobile shift was happening and all of that, then I think I acted almost completely like a CPO.
Got it. And related to that, I had a connected question. Was your all team in-sourced, or you had, because market generally doesn't produce head of technology or CPO right away to hire, right? And the mean time to hire is also quite high. So did you have vendors supporting you to fill in the roles that is needed, or all the strategic roles were always insourced?
I can't think of any strategic role that was outsourced. All of the senior roles were in-house. We probably had about 10-15% of engineers who were, outsourced, but these were relatively in junior positions.
Okay. Do you have any preference of in-source versus outsource? I mean, it's probably a different question altogether.
I mean, I think as far as possible, especially for a startup which is trying to be agile and so on, you should be in-sourced. But there are many situations which demand that you be outsourced, but these should be for relatively execution-oriented roles.
Okay.
I would say crossing the threshold of about 15-20% for outsource starts becoming dangerous.
In what way?
In terms of many things, right? Number one is that, just having strategic viewpoint of what you're building, right? So, but more importantly than that is culture, right? So you have to have ownership of the code you're building. And this is assuming it's a very IP oriented company, right? It's intellectually property oriented. If it is a very operational company, then I'll probably change that number to some other higher number. But if there's a lot of intellectual property you're building, then that's kind of your crown jewels, and you better own that.
Cool. Hey, so Shrikant, I actually sort of took the mic back because of some background noise. So if you have another question, you can raise the hand again. Thank you so much for the question, though. So I would like to move on to the next question, which is basically review of the technology function. So quite often seasonally there is a pressure to cut down cost, right? And technology people are usually the most I would say quite decently paid people, right? So very often startups come under this review, and in technology functions also often come into the review. So how should the review of a technology function be done, technology department? And how should a CTO be able to justify a question like, why 200 engineers, why not 20?
Yeah. So first of all, I think, and this will be a little bit jarring to the people that have a technology background in this audience, which is probably all of you. But, remember, just like anybody can be over-resourced, technology can be over-resourced, right? It's not true that, if a company needs 50 people and you have 200, then you're not over-resourced, right? That is, you can always overhire and be in a bad situation. So just like any other function, you really need to have, the fundamental question is how much technology is appropriate for this business. Because at the end of the day, right, you can overhire in any function. You can overhire in operations, you can overhire in sales, you can overhire in technology also. And your usual justification I see of, most heads of engineering for whatever count they have is look at the work that's there, right? And they'll say, okay, we have to do this, we have to do that, we have to do this. And so hence we need 200 engineers, right? So the first requirement is for you to be a little bit detached from the people. And when you're making this call, I mean, not during your normal days, but when you're when you're doing these, annual assessments, you should really be detached and figure out how much do I really need for this business? And both in terms of what I can actually foresee and for the long term. And usually the answer is that, if you can break it up into three parts. There's many ways to do this. The way I used to do it was to think about it in three parts. Number one is, suppose, a catastrophe were to happen and the 2008 like crisis were to happen. And, we just, either it's a choice between the company's death and whatever number of people I need to have, right? What is that number? And that is basically what you would call the BAU number, just to run the business as usual without doing any single feature, right? And that itself is very hard for people to digest and think of. But suppose you had nothing to do but except just keep the product running, right? These are DevOps people and a few engineers to keep the new banners coming up or whatever else, right? And that number would probably be very small. And if it is not small, then you're not really asking that question toughly to yourself, right? Then the second set of questions is, okay, the next set of people I need to have is how many people do I need to maintain my market share? And this is assuming that, you just look around you and see who else is doing what, how many engineers do they have, how much are they paying for their engineers? So if you, for example, are competing against Amazon, then they have a lot of engineering resources, right? And then you probably need more. But if you're not competing against a very big company and so on, and the other companies have less engineering resources and so on, you may not need that much just to manage your market share, right? And then the third thing is your competitive differentiation. What are the big bets you're making? That's the third bucket. And how much are you putting in for these big wins, right? Next year and the year after. And there you should divide it up into specific projects that you're doing and what you think the ROI of the projects are, and not in that next year, because many tech projects don't work out in that first year. So think of a 2-3 year investment and say, okay, how much do I really need for that? Right? And many times, I mean, frankly speaking, like even at Myntra and my own thing, that third bucket, you tend to be very frivolous about in times of good money. And frankly, you can cut all of it out when times are bad, right? So, I don't want to say it because there's some Myntra folks I see here, but I would say at any point, let's say there were 100 engineers, I would say probably that ratio would have been 20 engineers to just run the business, about another 20, 30 to maintain market share. At any point, we could have probably cut 40 for the competitive differentiation and still maintained our market share and still won.
Interesting. I think really love the demarcation between these buckets, and it actually puts the person who is deliberating into totally different shoes each time. Yeah. Interesting. So, my last question from my side, and then maybe more audience questions can come, is that so many businesses seem to be working absolutely fine from the outside. So, for example, Swiggy works beautifully even today, right? So, the CTO in companies which are already built, right, or especially companies which do not have a very evident technology flavor, how should the CTO keep uncovering new areas or new aspects of the business where technology can deliver value or transformation?
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, Myntra is a very good example. When I joined there, there was a 40-50% engineering team, but largely they were thought of outside the engineering team. If you talk to the other people, they would call it IT, right? They would say, oh, IT department mein hai wahan pe, right? So it was very jarring for me when I came from the valley and I was like, okay, I'm managing the engineering team and the tech and the product team. Oh, acha, IT mein kaam karte ho. So like, that is the mindset that people have. And, when I was stepping back, right, you might think it's wrong, but when you step back, it's not wrong. It's not wrong, because at the end of the day, what they perceive you as doing is that you are not really changing the business direction in any significant way. You are providing support to whatever tools they need or whatever things they need, and to run the website and make sure this website doesn't go down, all of that, right? So, coming back to your question, right, if you really want to invest in IT, then the investment better be worth it, right? It better be doing some game-changing things, right? So you have to start with not saying, okay, I'm going to do scale, or I'm going to do tech debt, or I'm going to do that, right? First, you have to ask yourself, what is the product I can build that will make Myntra, or this is true for any company, will make it a very differentiated market leader, right? So, for example, at Myntra, if you look, I'm just going to take Myntra as example because it's kind of obvious in retrospect, but at that time it wasn't, right? So you look, okay, there's 10 other companies doing it, and there's big players like Amazon and Flipkart and so on. How are you going to differentiate yourself, right? So if you differentiate and you ask that question very deeply, you say, okay, really you're a fashion e-commerce company. So what is it that you need for fashion, right? And really, if you look at it and you digest everything, you say, okay, if I build better warehouses and better delivery boys, you're not going to win, because Amazon and Flipkart and the bigger companies can build better warehouses, better delivery boys, more scale. You can't build more AWS-like things. You can't build better web servers, better scale, better, payment systems. None of that will work, because they have more engineers. They will be able to do that. So when you are in that situation, right, you have to think of a direction that you're going to go in, where the bigger lion that is chasing you and a mouse, right? Where can the mouse go where the lion will hate to go? Will say, no, I should definitely not go there, right? So when you look at that, right, you say, okay, what can Myntra do that an Amazon person who's looking at Myntra doing that will say, no, that's a stupid idea, I shouldn't do that, right? So, for example, at Myntra, those would be, I'm going to show bigger images, right? And when you look at it at Flipkart and Amazon, say, wait a minute, come on, if I show bigger images, I can show fewer products. If I show bigger banners of brands and so on, I can show fewer categories, right? So then you start feeling like, oh shit, I'm a product manager competing against this Myntra guy, and I can't go there because he's doing things which is against my business, right? So you have to start taking things in weird directions, which will be hard for others you are competing with to follow. Same thing, I'm going to give the brand a lot of visibility. Whereas if you're an Amazon or Flipkart, you want to kind of pressure the brand down and you want to put the retailer on the top, right? Same thing with where you invest in the supply chain. Instead of investing in the warehousing and the logistics, you invest in the inbound supply chain, which is how you make products, right? So private brands, for example, and you put tech into all of that, right? So these are just examples where I think in any business you think of, okay, I am the small guy. There are either medium or bigger size guys there. Now, if I have to win, then I have to start going in directions and doing things which is going to make the other guys very uncomfortable, right? And usually in those, not that all of those ideas are good, but some of those ideas will end up being quite important. Same thing like, Myntra just going mobile only. I don't know if that's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's going to make everybody very, very uncomfortable, right?
Definitely. So you are actually hinting towards some really bold moves here, but then what's that lens, so to say? So you talked about. So there's definitely you gave one criteria that your competition should be considering it stupid, but then how to keep generating these ideas or again uncovering more areas where technology can deliver. So is there like a yardstick or a simple question which is a yes or a no?
Yeah. I mean, basically, for people here who have, opened fortune cookies in Chinese, restaurants, right? Usually there's this, little proverb that goes that you can take whatever phrase it says in the Chinese, fortune cookie, and you add the phrase in bed, and it becomes a very, flirty, weird thing to read then, right? So same way, right? The question we would ask ourselves in Myntra, and this is applicable to any company, is you take any phrase, any idea, anywhere in e-commerce, and then you add the phrase for fashion to it, right? And then you start thinking, wait, okay, warehousing. I want to build faster warehouse. Okay. So you say, okay, what is the fastest warehouse for fashion? Right. And then you might come up with a different kind of warehouse than what a Flipkart or an Amazon is building. Right. Or you say, I want to build a shopping experience. And you say, okay, so I want to build a shopping experience for fashion. Okay. So then you say, oh, okay, that will be very different. Right. So that is the keyword, and that for fashion is Myntra's positioning, right? And actually, it's a higher level statement that we used to call internally to help people look good, right? So then you can actually ask the question, what is the best warehouse that will make people look good, right? So that is why it's so important to have a positioning of your company and a product, and goes back to product market fit. Once you've identified what your key differentiated positioning is, then every product question just becomes for that product positioning, right? So you can take any idea in the world, right? And you can just always add for that product positioning to it, and then evaluate if it's a good idea or a bad idea, right? So for example, I'll take up, people now say doing live video shopping, right? And you say, okay, that's a good idea. So live video shopping for fashion. Let's see, what would that be? And then you come up with, oh, maybe there would be a trial room and people would be coming out of the trial room and showing what the clothes look like and go on, and people can shop. I don't know. I mean, probably a stupid idea, but it's a framework to evaluate that idea, right?
Yeah, I think I really really like this. Reinforced focus on the positioning. It sort of brings every function, every person who wants to ideate for the business, because there are so many smart brains working for startups these days. This framework will actually channelize all ideas into the right bucket.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for articulating it really well for us. So there is a question from Raj Kola, who is the director of engineering at Tolia. Hey
Yeah,
Raj.
Shamik, thank you for sharing your insights to start off with. As my question is, as someone who wore both the hats, that of a CPO and a CTO, how do you think a CTO should be contributing to three horizon strategy for a company?
So Yeah, there was a little bit of background noise. So let me first rephrase the question to see if I understood it right. Your question is, how should engineering leader be contributing to the strategy of a company? Is that the right question?
Yeah, specifically around three horizon strategy, like what I should be doing, what my company should be doing 1 year from now, 2 years, or 3 to 5 years from now. Yep.
Yeah. So I have worked in bigger companies, but including HP and Yahoo. But most of my career is in startups. So I feel like while I've written 3-year strategic papers and so on, I mostly did not have the luxury to look at that long a period, right? Usually it used to be a one maximum 2 years, right?
To repeat my question, as someone who wore both the hats of CPO and CTO, how would you suggest upcoming CTOs to think on three horizon strategies for a given company? Please proceed.
Yeah. So I don't know where I got cut off, so I'll just repeat from the beginning.
Sure.
Basically, at a very high level, right? You first I would say spend the first 6 months to just understand the business very deeply, talking to a lot of people, actually doing deliveries, going to the warehouses. If it's an e-commerce, if it's some other business, then understanding the customer's pain point that you're really trying to solve very, very deeply. And this goes, people often think that this is the role of a CPO or a product guy or the operation or the biz guy, but I think that you can't really be a good technologist until you understand that first. So if you're a leader, as a technology leader, spend the first 6 months understanding the business very deeply. And you should come back with a thesis saying, this is the key pain point. And from this key pain point, this is our key solution. If you're not able to articulate that, and I would encourage all of you to write it down on a piece of paper, right? My understanding of the customer problem, first of all, who the customer is, in about 4 bullet points. Second is, what is their main problem? Thirdly, what is my solution? And how I'm going to solve that, create that solution, right? This should be a one-pager that should be, I used to write this in an email to myself after I've spent 6 months at a company, right? So I understand exactly what the problem is, right? And after you understood that, then you create a strategy of what you think, how you go about building that solution. And this can, depending on how great as a visionary you are, it can take, a 3-year, 2-year, 1 year. Like, they say that, Steve Jobs knew that to build the iPhone, it would take 9 years, right? So he had that in his mind, right? When he joined, like in 2001, he had kind of got it all in place, right? I've never been able to think ahead more than 2, maybe 3 years at most, right? So you have to kind of use whatever visionary power you have to think about how this product will shape up in 1, 2, 3 years, right? And then you have to construct your process of how you're going to make that happen, right? And that is usually, I'm going to need so many resources. That's money, people, time, all of that. This is how I'm going to organize it. These are the teams, these are the pods and so on that are going to get created. This is the tech stack that I'm going to invest in, and this is why. And then you have to create project milestones and how you're going to execute it, right? All of this should be probably another 2-3 pages worth of thought, right? That you should put in. And once you've got that, you will be amazed at how much clarity it gives internally for the next year, 2 years for your execution, because you've put that thinking in and you have that internal confidence of being able to talk, right? I think, a lot of Myntra folks used to say, Shamik, you're very clear about what you want to do, right? And the actual truth is that I was very, very, very unsure for a long period. I would say almost a year, about what is it that Myntra really stands for. I wasn't clear at all, right? But it took me almost a year to understand the business, understand India, understand people, understand how to execute and all of that. And that year of probably mid 2012 to mid 2013 was a very shaky, unconfident year for me. But after I've put in that year and time, I think the next 3-4 years I was very sure about what needed to be done.
Good. That helps. Thank you so much, Shamik. Thanks for sharing your insights.
Yeah.
Hey, that was a very good question, and I really, really appreciate your candid answer, Shamik. And I personally can also vouch for this practice of putting your thoughts down in pen and paper, and that actually brings amazing amount of clarity. So I'm done from my side. Any more audience questions? Shrikant, you had a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Shamik, this question is related to Yeah, I think the technology and the product management is ever changing, right? There are a lot of ideas on how you could do product management. There are tons of books that keeps coming out.
Yeah.
Even in technology, there is like tons of ideas on how you can do things, right? I mean, to constantly keep yourself up to date. And as a leader, you got to have answers, like you said, when others ask, you need to have at least a sufficient confidence to say, okay, I think this is the right thing to do. Let's go ahead and try it, right? So, how do you keep yourself, uh, or how have you kept yourself up to date in terms of your personal goals, knowledge, and self development?
Yeah, it's a good question. See, the truth is that technology changes so fast that, and not just the what of it, like not only the fact that ML is hot now or this is that, but even the how of it, right? Even in whether you take something like software engineering,
Yeah,
waterfall, and then agile, and pair programming, extreme programming, blah blah blah. All of them keep on changing, right?
yeah,
And the tech stacks keep changing. So whether it's web and then became mobile, then PWA, then this or that. There's
yeah,
always a right way of doing things and a wrong way, supposedly, of doing things, right? And then there's product
yeah.
management practices, all of this. So the world keeps on changing, and all I will say is that I've been kind of self-taught. I've read a lot of books. I read a lot of articles on Medium. I On the tech side, I always am dabbling with some new library or some new tool to figure out how it works and so on. Just a year and a half ago, I spent like whole 6 months building my own cryptocurrency from first principles using Satoshi's paper and nothing else, right? So what would it look like, right? So you kind of are always dabbling in things like this, and that kind of helps you learn stuff. But the I think the my net is have a little bit of equanimity, right? Which by that I mean that whatever you hear, right, this is the thing, right? Whenever you hear that, I feel like that's a cult belief, right? You always feel that there's people who are too strongly convinced about it than what is actually needed, right? So I'll tell you like a very concrete example. Like today, people will say everything has to be AI, right? If there's no AI in something, then it's like bullshit, right? And you can take that to an extreme. Of course, there's the kernel of truth in it, right? But I think many times, especially more people who haven't done many different products will take that as to the extreme and say, okay, everything has to have AI or everything has to have machine learning and so on. And there's lots of problems in this world that don't need too much of intelligence even. So I would say that take everything with a grain of salt, and the more you read, the more you try things out, the more you dabble with stuff, the better base of knowledge you have to be able to kind of do pattern recognition and to be able to figure out what might work.
Great. So again, sorry, Shrikant, for taking the mic back, and because there was some background noise. There is another question by CB. CB is a ex-Common Floor colleague, and he is right now a senior director at Salesforce. I'm accepting. So one feedback that I am observing is that there should be muting and sound noise control. Yeah, I think it's taking a little more time for Sibi to get on the stage. Sibi, I am just dismissing this request. Sorry for that. And can you just type your question? You type your question in text. Okay, there is a question from Raghubansh Mani. My question is, what are the top focus areas for CTOs in a very early stage startup, and how do you ensure that all these areas are getting enough attention, especially since you don't have many people to delegate to?
Yeah, good question. I think, first of all, I'll caveat that, I've been at very, very early stage startups, including being a founder, and been at very, very large companies like Yahoo and HP, where there's like more than 10,000 engineers, right? So the answers don't apply to all companies equally. It's like saying, okay, what is appropriate for a baby is appropriate for a 50-year-old. That's absolutely not true. You know that. So same thing for companies as well. So the CTO's role is extremely different in different stages of a company. But for a very early stage company, there's one goal that everyone shares, everyone in the company, and that's survival, right? If you don't survive to the next stage, no matter how cool a thing you do, doesn't work, right? So it's actually even more paramount, and I'm going to make a controversial statement here, that's even more paramount. Survival is even more paramount than customer. So at a very early stage startup. And for what I mean by that is really your customers can change in the startup, in the early stage startup. You might be doing X, and I've seen people successfully pivot out to a completely different customer, right, in 6 months. And what you have to do at that first early stage is to be in a mode of learning. And the faster you're learning, the faster you understand the market and the opportunity gap, the more the chances of survival, right? So at that early stage, the very first year of the company, you are constantly have to be in a mode of hacking, right? You have to do something, put it out to customer, learn, and then say, oh shit, this customer itself is bad customer. I don't want to go actually after this. And you modify and you go after some other customer or some other product. And you have to be able to build something and test it out with that new customer base. So this whole mode of operation is what I feel like the whole first year looks like for most startups, at least for the good ones. And that is why actually I feel like sometimes, I've made some investments in companies where the engineering person has come from a larger companies and has never experienced this, and they put their process or architecture purity or scale or we need to study one customer very well and have a good PRD before we do things. These are all very good at second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh stages of a company, but in that first stage of the company, it's a very, very different world. And people who either don't have the mentality for that or have never experienced it before, they will put wrong things into that company and cause it to die.
Great. I think CB has posted his question, and his question is the bold move at Myntra that you guys took to go mobile only. In retrospect, do you have data to say that that was a great move?
I would say it's like in retrospect, I would say it was a no-op move, right? And by no-op moves, I think basically in chess, sometimes you make a move which doesn't really have much effect on the game, right? And but it might still have just psychological effect, right? So to me, people don't talk about all the other moves that Myntra made, which I think worked out very well. This to me, while it gets the most PR and the most news, to me this actually did not change the game in either a positive or a negative way significantly, right? Reality is at that time we had about 30-40% of our revenues coming from desktop. And we knew that suppose, for example, you were to do mobile only, it would go from half of those people would have no problem, the 40, right? Half of them would have no problem. They'll say, okay, because I'm already using mobile and desktop, I'll just use the mobile only. So it became a 20% problem, and that 20% would keep on diminishing over time, right? Which is exactly what happened. As soon as we switched off, that 60 went to 80, and then over the next year and a half, 2 years, it became around 12, 13, right? And at that time, for various other tactical reasons, Myntra decided to bring the desktop back. But the whole game usually doesn't change for a 20% factor when the whole market is growing 40-50% year on year, which it still is, by the way, e-commerce, right, and fashion. So when your market is 80% in something and the market is growing 40% year on year, then is 10% of something worth obsessing over? Not really. Whether you shut it down or you don't, doesn't really matter.
Interesting. Cool. And we are almost out of time as well. So there are no more questions from the audience and no more hand requests. So thank you so much, Shamik, for taking time out and interacting with us. And
quite welcome.
So this will be recorded, and we'll share the recording with the community. Thanks again, and thank you so much for everybody who has tuned in. After I end the broadcast, there will be virtual tables where all of us can interact. Maybe Shamik can also join us if Shamik has time.
So yeah, I'll be there for another half an hour, 15 minutes.
Okay, great. On virtual tables, great. Sure. I'm ending the session.